time for a restring. All right, it's time to string. The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna cut this string out. Now, one piece of advice, I suggest that you guys cut your strings out as soon as you can, because in theory, if you just leave one string broken, you could, in theory again, weaken the frame of the racket. So let's cut it out, and I'm gonna cut it in a plus sign. So I'm gonna cut up, and then I'm gonna cut across, all right? And starting in the middle. All right. I've cut all my crosses, and now I'm gonna cut my mains. All right, now all my strings are cut out. Get rid of the strings now. This can get a little bit messy. The way I like to do it is to just prop all the strings out, just like that. And then what I do is try to get the strings that are left, the ones where I've got the knot, just drop this. Okay, now that we've gotten rid of the string, we're going to place the racket on the stringer. And this is very important. You want to make sure that you're applying pressure at the same time on both sides. So we're going to first put the top and the bottom mounts. So don't put too much pressure first. Then I'm going to go to the side mounts. Just have it barely touch the frame. Do the same on the other side. And then once both sides are touching the frame, then I can actually go and tighten it a little bit more. So we're going to start tightening it now. You don't want it too tight, but make sure it's tight enough that it doesn't move when you actually put the tension. All right, so racket's set up. Turn on the machine. And we're going to be using kilos, and we're going to be stringing this racket at 23 kilos. Some explosive bite from Dunlop. And we're going to string this racket in 4 knots. Now, most players nowadays string in 4 knots. It is a lot easier for stringers to string in 4 knots as well. And the reason is that when you're stringing the mains, it's just a lot quicker. So you do waste a little time having to do 4 knots instead of just 2. But when you're pulling the mains out, you only have to pull the mains through, whereas if you're doing 2 knots, you're pulling the strings you need for the mains and the strings you need for the crosses, so it actually takes a little bit longer to string in 2 knots. We're going to count how much string we need for the mains. 2, 3, and 4 right here. And this is what I need for the mains. So you want to make sure you count the right amount of string you need for the mains. And then we start. We're going to start from the bottom. Always very important to know where you're going to start first. All right, and then when I pull my mains through, I want to make sure I've got the same amount of string on both sides of the racket, since both sides are symmetrical. All right, do a quick double check. Make sure we've got the same amount of string on both sides. And yes, we do. And then tighten up one string. I want to make sure the clamps are not holding too tight around the string as to not damage the string. There we go. All right, and I'm going to start by putting tension on those first 2 strings, and then we're going to go one at a time. All right. Put the clamp back on. There we go. And undo. There we go. So the ideal way to do it is to do a couple strings, maybe 3 strings on one side and 3 strings on the other side, to make sure you keep the tension even on both sides. I'll do one more on this side. We'll go ahead and do the other side. There we go. Move to the other side. You want to make sure when you're pulling your mains through that you don't get the string knotted up, because again you could damage the string. You want to make sure the strings stay as new as possible for when the first balls are hit with it. There we go. I've got 3 and 3. I'm going to go ahead and do 3 more on this side, and then do 3 on the other side. Now the tricky part when you're doing the mains is just to know which hole you're going to skip. So on this one, I don't have to skip anything yet. So this is an 18 by 20. That means I have 9 strings on each side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Got my 7th right here. And I believe I'm skipping my 8th hole and my 9th hole. So let's see. If you don't know which hole to skip, then the best way is generally to sort of look at the gap between each string. And if you get to a smaller gap, that means you need to skip a hole. I'm going to do this last one on this side. There we go. So this is the first hole that I skipped. This was hole number 8. Go ahead and move forward on the other side. Sometimes those clamps get in the way. That's why those pliers come in handy. getting close to the end of the racket, or the end of the mains at least. All right, this is our 8th hole. So this, we're skipping 1 for the cross. And then on the last hole, I believe we're skipping another 1. And yep, there we go. All right, so sometimes when you're doing 4 knots, you'll finish the mains on top of the hoop. In this case, we're finishing on top. And sometimes you'll finish on the bottom, depending on the string pattern. And so for the knot, I'm going to choose which hole I want to tie my knot in. Ideally, you want to choose a hole that's as close as possible to the last main that you just did, so as to not lose too much tension. So I'm going to probably look for this hole, see if I can make this a little bit sharper. There we go. Should be able to go right through now. Yep. All right, so this is the last string. I kept 23 kilos all throughout. Now some stringers put a little bit more tension on the last couple of string to compensate for the loss of tension when they tie their knot. I tie my knot pretty tight, so I don't feel like I lose too much tension. And just for safety, I do a second knot. You can get away with just doing 1 knot, but just in case, we're just going to do 2. There we go. Now you don't want to pull too tight on the knot because you might weaken the string. So as long as the knot is tight, nothing's going to happen. All right, so we're good with the one side. One side of the mains is good. And then we're going to finish this main with this last string right here. Same thing, I'm putting that same tension. And as you get better with stringing, you can take the exact amount that you need. As you can see, I barely have enough string for my last tension. If I had one more string to do, I wouldn't be able to finish it, but I was able to calculate this the right way. Same thing, trying to make this a little sharper so it goes through. There we go. A few different ways to tie in the knot. I just do a regular knot, and I do 2 of them. I feel like this is what works best to be able to hold the tension. All right. And this is how you start your 4 knots. You start with the mains, and whether you're doing a hybrid or just 4 knots, the technique is the same. We've got our mains, and now we're going to start our crosses. Just make sure we have enough strings. 1, 2, 3. All right, we're good. So now when you're doing 4 knots, or when you're doing hybrid, you have to do 4 knots. You always want to start on the top of the frame, and the reason why is because, in theory, the top of the frame is a little bit weaker than the bottom, so you want to start by putting the pressure on top of the frame and then work your way to the throat. Something else to think about, a lot of players like to use 2 different tensions, so 1 tension for the mains that we just did, and then a lower tension for the cross. And the reason why you use a lower tension for the cross is because the mains are generally longer than the crosses. So here we've used 23 for the mains, and we're going to drop the tension to 22 for the crosses. Now, for the crosses, once you do most of your crosses, which are the ones that are here, where you're not going through some of those mains, I always like to start on top and finish in the bottom, and so I have to find a way to make sure that this is what I get. So what I do here is I'm going to start here in the bottom, and then weave. I'm going to go on top and bottom, and over there I'm going to finish on top. Wherever you start, you finish the opposite. So here I start on the bottom, and I finish on top. And this way, I'm going to be able to get most of my weaving done in the same way. So when you do your knot, just pull a little bit of string. Again, try to tie in your knot as close to that string that just exited. So here, I'm tying it in the grommet right next to it. Again, just use my pliers to tighten that knot. And again, this very first cross that I make is actually important that you do 2 knots. There we go. Cut it as short as possible. And then I'm actually gonna put in 2 crosses every time before I tighten that first one. So since that first string that I did, I started on the bottom, but technically if I go from here, I start on the top. So this next one, I'm gonna start on the bottom because I'm skipping an extra string. So here, start in the bottom, and I'm gonna finish on top. And what I want is to actually start on top and finish on the bottom. And so now for the next cross, I'm gonna get to where I want. So that first string is actually gonna tighten the knot. There we go. All right. There we go. So now, something that's very important also, you don't want to just pull your cross through, because if you do that, you're going to create friction, which is what actually leads you to break your string in the first place. You want to make sure you alleviate that friction by pushing the string as high as possible as you pull it. You'll feel, as you're doing that, you'll feel the string just kind of slide through. You're not going to feel any resistance. If you feel resistance, you're creating friction, and that may lead to the strings breaking a little bit early. So again, the way I did it, now I get to most of my cross strings, and I'm always going to start on the top, and I'm going to finish in the bottom. And so there's different weaving techniques. I like to actually have a bit of an arc with my string. Again, same thing. I want to alleviate that friction by pushing it up every time. I just like to use my fingers. Some people like to use an awl. Same thing here. I'm going to start on top. And so I go with a little arc with the string, and then that makes it easy for me to just go to weave pretty fast through. All right, so if you're starting on top and you finish on top, you know there's a problem. If you start on top and you finish on the bottom, you've done well, unless you've skipped more than one string, but that's unlikely. All right, something else you want to do if you want to make sure your crosses are aligned is every time you pull it all the way through, is you try to drop that string as low as possible, and then it's just going to naturally align. So here again, start on top, finish on the bottom. And you want to make sure you don't create any knots, because that might weaken the string and lead it to break prematurely. Always be careful when you pull it through. Same thing, start on top and finish in the bottom. And so the idea, whether you're focusing on your string horizontally, you're always going up and under, on top, above and under. So what I do in terms of the clamps, I generally leave 2 clamps on. And whenever I get to a new string, I undo one of them, and I just leave the other one on. So in this case, I'm doing this one, the other one stays on, just for safekeeping, just in case. If you're weaving fast and you're not sure whether or not you did a good job, you can just always check it. Make sure it's above and under, all the way, and here we're good. That's something maybe for your first rackets, you might want to check that quite often. And as you get better, you'll usually see it or feel it if you messed up. about halfway done. This is an 18 by 20, so these rackets take the longest. I actually have 2 extra mains compared to a 16 main racket, and 20 crosses is the maximum amount of crosses you can have on most rackets. I actually have never seen any racket. I've never seen a racket with more than 20 crosses. And so here, so I said I'd keep 2 clamps on every time, but this one's kind of getting in the way, so I'm just going to take that one off. It's okay because the other one's still on. I'm going to flip it around for the next string. As long as that one clamp stays in place, I'm okay. There you go, and then I go the other way so that I have the space I need to keep going. So towards the end of the racket, I tend to get a little less space to move around. So this is where sometimes I just leave one clamp on. That way I have a little bit more space to move my hands for the weaving. The way I do it, I create a little arc like this with the string, so a little circle, and then I use generally two or three fingers from each hand. And so you start up, going down and up and down. And so while one set of fingers pushes the string down, the other one pushes the strings up. And then as you feel it, you just kind of go quicker. And as you're pushing the string forward, your bottom fingers push the string up and your top fingers push the string down as it moves forward. And so you're going over and or below and above the string every time. And this is just really a technique that you get used to. You know, the more you string, and when you're first starting, it might take a little bit of time, but as you get better, you can find a technique that works for you. Some stringers just use the tip of the string. I find that with a poly, I struggle to make it slide, so I like to use that little circle that I showed you. Yeah, same thing, this one's getting in the way. Move that around, so here I create my little circle, and then from here I push it in and out. I got my top fingers that push it down, bottom fingers that push it up. And here we're getting to the end. I've got about 5 strings left. That's where it gets a little bit tougher. So I've got less space to work with. I'll be able to manage. And again, even in the end, you still want to make sure you alleviate that friction when you're pulling your strings through, so that you get the most out of your strings in terms of longevity. All right. Well, and the 18 by 20 string pattern, since it's tighter, it makes those last few strings a little bit harder to pull through. It takes a little bit more time. I'm down to the last 4 strings right there. Again, you want to make sure you always stay with what you started. So I started up on most strings, and I always want to finish below until I get to those last few strings where I'm going to skip some mains. So then obviously switch it up. There we go. Make sure when you pull it through, make sure you don't knot up your string, especially there where I'm going behind the mount. I want to make sure I stay aligned so I don't weaken the string. Here we are good. There we go. Down to my last three. So this is the last string that I'm doing where I'm starting above and finishing below. And the next one, since I'm skipping two mains, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to start below and I'm going to finish above. And the very last one, I'm skipping two more mains. I'm going to go back to starting above and finishing below. So here, there we go. So since I took exactly the right amount of string for those last three strings, I'm not going to be able to weave that next string in. I'm going to have to tighten it up right away. That's what I'm going to do right here. So I'm tying it up right away. All right, here. So those last two strings on an 18 by 20 are always a little bit trickier just because you've got the clamp in the way and you've got less space to work with. So here, since I'm skipping the one main on each side, I'm starting below and I'm going to finish above. And this is almost the one where I have to go one by one. Because again, with an 18 by 20, I've got less space as I do with a 16 by 19 string pattern. Right here, finished above, started below, finished above. I gotta use my pliers to be able to get through the mains. There we go. And again, same thing, try to alleviate that friction even though I don't have too much space. And I'm down to my last string. So here, since we've skipped two mains, we're going back to the way we had it, which is start above and finish below. So here, since I have even less space to work with, I'm practically doing it 2 by 2. And here for those last two, finish below. There we go. Same thing, try to alleviate as much of that friction as possible. There we go. And that last tightening. All right. Okay, and this is the last knot right here. So again, I want to try to do my knot in the grommet that's the closest to the last string that I just pulled out. So in this case, I've got a grommet right to the right of this one. So push this one through. If it struggles to go through, but you know it's a hole that you can use, just use your pliers, like so, and then just pull it out. So here, it's coming out on the left of this string. So basically, I've got my main, where that was going through this grommet, and this has come out on the right side of my main. So I come out of the right side, I want to go over to the left side of that main, and then I'm going to go through that circle, that gap that I just created, and just pull through. And again, you don't want to create too much friction. That's one knot. Tighten that knot a little bit. Okay, once I've tightened that knot, do a second one. At this point, I can almost take the clamp away, but I'm just going to do that second knot. So same thing, go through the left, and then under in that gap that I just created, and then pull through. And slowly for that last knot. I'll cut it as short as you can. Make sure it doesn't get in the way. There we go. And now I am done. And then I want to unmount the racket, both sides at the same time. There we go. You have it. If you feel like they're not aligned, you can always line them a bit more before starting to hit with them. But here we did a pretty good job. All right, we're done with our racket. Now don't forget to honor your sponsorship and stencil your racket. And that's how you restring your racket to maximize longevity.